Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and today I want to share with you a review of the books and materials we used for our anatomy main lesson block. So the first thing I actually want to show you is the main lesson book, and this is the main lesson book that I created alongside with my daughter. And we chose to do this, or I chose to do this in a main lesson book rather than on the chalkboard for a few reasons. One, I have this to show you now so you can see a progression of our lessons. And the other thing is that whenever there were illustrations that my daughter still needed to include into her main lesson book, if they were on the chalkboard, and currently we just have the one chalkboard, then I would have to wait till that lesson was done, which is actually not the worst thing. It kind of keeps us on track. But having it in a main lesson book meant that my daughter could use the main lesson book as inspiration for illustrations, which she always does, and not be pressured to have to get that lesson done before we move on to another lesson. So it's actually kind of a double-edged sword because we don't want to carry so many lessons that are not complete while we move on to new lessons. But as we do a 3-day cycle roughly with our lessons, there's always going to be time that we are doing our illustrations for a previous lesson. Let me move these books out of the way for a moment so I can show you everything a little bit easier. We're always going to be doing an illustration for a lesson from the previous days or 2 days previous lesson. So we'll deliver the lesson, and which is the easy part in my opinion, because that's the more passive learning. And for this main lesson block, we primarily use the book by Charles Kovacs, this one, rather than the curriculum. And so the way that we would do this is that I would read the chapter, and then following that, we would do the illustration and the written work. So let's go through. The first lessons actually were more, I want to say, holistic in a way, and very much according to the Waldorf pedagogy, which I actually found this both a great way to do the lessons and also very confusing. And in part, it was confusing for me as a teacher who, while I am very familiar with the Waldorf pedagogy, this is only the second time, maybe third time I've done an anatomy block. And the first time we did the anatomy block, we did it a little bit more like an anatomy unit study. And then the second time we did it, we did not complete the unit. And so this time I was trying to be really careful about going through the lessons in a way that adhered more closely with the Waldorf approach. And for that, the very beginning of the lessons, this is divided up into 3 sections. So the very beginning lessons are health and the human body, and then the next part is physiology, and then the last part is actually muscles and bones. And this part is really the part that you would typically, in my opinion, associate with an anatomy block, is the things that have to do with the structure of the body itself. And that's the last part that we did. And honestly, we actually did not complete all of our illustrations and our written work for that. And that's something that I am debating about whether we are going to complete or not as we begin this new school year. I am recording this several months after we unofficially finish this block, but before we are starting the new school year. And I had not intended to do a block in anatomy for this school year, but I think it will be important to continue with the lessons that we did not complete for a few reasons. One is that I don't think that this block will come up again this way again for our homeschool for sure, and I'm not sure how much of this information will come up in the future. So I do want to do that. And the other thing is just for completeness and for practicing finishing something, which generally I'm pretty good at, but my daughter may not have that same skill set. And honestly, I'm the one who is captaining this ship. So if I'm not in charge of finishing this, she's certainly not going to. Okay, so the very beginning of this has to do with health and the human body. And so this, even though the topics like uprightness and the spine, posture and walking, head, trunk and limbs, sleep, the skin, care of skin, the 4 elements of the body, etc., all of those seem like topics that are anatomy focused. However, the book itself gave us more of a I want to say a spiritual approach to understanding that. And for all of the lessons that you see here, especially the ones that are a little bit more spiritual, like the head, trunk, and limbs, for instance, or posture and gait, and then the ones at the very beginning, which because of their spiritual nature, we did them from a religious perspective. All of these lessons are available on the website, on the blog post that accompanies this video, and you can find that link in the description box below if you want to see the trajectory of these lessons. If I were to do it again, I would have paid attention to the whole arc of that first section and decide for myself the lessons that I thought would help support that arc according to what I wanted a little bit more for that first section. And I would have tried to dive into more of the anatomy lessons a little bit sooner. By the time we did that, we had already spent so much of our time and our mental energy doing lessons that I struggled with. And so that's part of me being a new teacher with this information, and also not really understanding the deeper meanings behind these lessons from the Waldorf perspective. And we were trying to do a Waldorf main lesson block. So for these lessons, I actually want to show you the book that we use the most for illustration. Well, actually, I can't say we use it the most, but we did rely on the book Anatomicum, which I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. So the anatomy book by Welcome to the Museum, we use this book extensively for illustrations. I do want to be mindful of showing you the illustrations because I found that with the newer resources that we had, the illustrations were extremely anatomically correct, and in some cases, in my opinion, not necessary to show that part of the anatomy when other parts of the written content had to do with other things. So if you're studying the eyes, you don't need to, in my opinion, you don't need to see an entire body, because that's what we would see in some of the other books. Or maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit. Maybe it would be like another part of the body, but the entire body would be exposed. And so I would be putting Post-its and things like I completely recognize for educational purposes, a lot of this is okay, but I did choose in many circumstances to have a little bit more modesty for illustrations. And I found that the more current books that we had were a little bit freer with their illustrations versus some of the older books that I had, or books that were intended for, say, elementary, were a little bit more modest in their illustrations and in their photographs. So for this book, what we would do a lot of times, let me see if I can find, I think this is probably a suitable example for the kidneys. What we would do is use the onion skin that is between the pages to help us with the illustrations. This is definitely not a Waldorf way to do this, but I found this helpful in a lot of circumstances. It both had its pros and cons. I'll go into that as well. But we would put the onion skin over the illustration. It wasn't the easiest to do, but it would at least give us a general outline so that then I could come back in and do the full illustration. In some cases, like for the epidermis and dermis, we did the same thing. I put the onion skin over the illustration. And this was helpful for accuracy, but what it did, the cons about it, the things that I don't think are necessary for this age and for this main lesson block, was that it took too much time, and it made it more detailed than we needed it to be detailed. Now, there is a place for detail and there is a place for accuracy. And the middle school years in a Waldorf setting, and really in any setting, is a time to focus on precision, accuracy, and details. It is a time that maybe you're beginning to do that. Prior to that, you do not need this level of detail, because the purpose of the lesson isn't to go into this kind of detail. It's to give us a general overview or an appreciation for the lesson and the content. In this case, we're looking for accuracy. So for the lesson specifically on dermis and epidermis, I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be a quick lesson. And the illustration took so long. I want to say some of the illustrations that I copied took about an hour and a half, which in my opinion, is way too long. It's excessive. It's not necessary for this lesson. And each time I went in thinking, this isn't going to take too much time. I think a half an hour for an illustration, anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes for an illustration is completely suitable. I think it gives you enough time to pay attention to the detail and to recreate that. And when you are doing that, you are learning so much. So don't overlook the importance of an illustration. It does call into your capacity for paying attention to detail and recreating it accurately. And in that slowing down, you are learning, you are processing, and you are paying attention to that detail. So for these lessons, the ones that I actually like the best, and if I were to do this all over again, this is where I would spend almost my entire focus when it came to illustrations, except for the things that were internal, would be self-portraits. And so I think our first self-portrait was for the skin, the dermis and the epidermis, and it was a self-portrait of our hand. And I didn't realize I was going to love this so much, but I loved it so much. Now, the way that you can be most successful with something like this is, your powers of observation, number one, but the tools that you are using. So the first thing is that I am right-handed. So I was looking at my left hand and writing with my right hand. This made it so much easier because then when we did the palm of our hand, I thought, well, I did my left hand, I'm going to do my right hand. And that didn't work so well because I am right-handed. So I'd be looking at my hand and then I would draw with my right hand. And that ended up not being as easy. And so finally I'm like, okay, I think I either erased it or started again. And then I just did it with my left hand so that I could be drawing and looking at the same time. So that's one thing to make it easier. The other thing is making sure that you have the right color pencils or whatever art medium you're using. We were using our Lyra color pencils, and there were only maybe 3 colors for us, for our skin tone, that worked. And it was like a peachy flesh color. And I even think it might have been called Flesh for that particular set. But there's also a set of Lyra, like the chubby pencils, which have a greater assortment of flesh colors and that you can use for illustrating humans or animals or landscapes. So they're good for all 3 of those. And they're going to have the subtle shades of tan and brown and black and peach and white. So when you have and probably in between, maybe ones that are a little bit more yellow based versus cool toned. So that set really helped us, as well as the few colors in our Lyra color set. If you don't have those colors and you just have the primary colors, there's no way, in my opinion, for you to be that accurate unless you really understand color theory and you know how to mix those colors together. So this is one lesson that when we did it and when we were done with it, I was blown away at how successful it was. I loved it so much, and I highly recommend that you do this. As we progressed through, we did a combination of self-portraiture and using our books for illustration purposes. If I were to do this lesson again, just in general with this amount of detail, I would not be tracing it at all. While our images are so beautiful in the end, I think that they're not necessary and they take away from your personal creativity and artistry. Also, when you're doing it on your own, unless you are that kind of person who is going to make it detailed, you get the purpose of the lesson without getting lost in the micro detail and the finer aspects of the detail. So for this one, I might have done just one hair follicle with the parts underneath and maybe 2 blood vessels. Very simple. A little bit with the deep fascia and hypodermis, maybe a little bit with that, but not to this level. When we did our palm facing self-portrait, we didn't spend as much time, and you can really see, in my opinion, the level of detail is different, but both would have been suitable. I just really love when we did the back of our hand. As we progress through these lessons, we get into different spiritual aspects. And so anytime that there was in this book in particular a spiritual aspect, we would include our own religious, spiritual aspects. And there were so many. When it came to anatomy, there were so many opportunities for us to include our religion. So our bodies, our world. So you're going to see things that part of the Waldorf pedagogy is to make the lessons relevant for the student. And in this particular lesson, we were looking at the relationship between our bodies and the world and the composition of water and solids in the world and salt in the world, like minerals, compared to our bodies. And so I love that kind of comparison. So that's where the first section, the first chapters focused on. When we got into digestion and other topics, sometimes I would take several lessons in this book, maybe like 3 or 4 or maybe 2 or 3 chapters, and then put that together into one lesson in the main lesson book that included narration and illustration. This is another one that included so much detail. We put the paper on over the book, and here, like, while it looks great, I don't think this is as educational as a more simple illustration. So as you're going through this and you see this illustration, I would not recommend doing it to this detail. I think especially for this particular topic, and it's really hard to see without the labeling. It's hard to see. It's a side profile of the internal that we would not have access to visually. And so I think doing, again, a self-portrait, maybe even like, say, your mouth open wide, which I do have an illustration of that later on, but we ended up copying it rather than doing a self-portrait. I think something like that would have been better for this particular illustration. And then in talking about digestion, I think a better way to look at this particular lesson would be to have some real life experiments with food and digestion and looking at how different foods feel in your mouth when you swallow them, in your digestion, how you feel like a day later or 6 hours later. I think all of that would have been a better representation, like more informative and a better lesson for this particular topic, rather than an illustration that, while I think looks really great, I don't think serves its purpose as well. Moving on, the food we eat. I thought it'd be really great to illustrate the different food groups, and I thought this is going to be like a really simple illustration. It won't take too much time. It took forever. This is another one that took between 1 and 2 hours, and it doesn't look like it should take that long, but you're looking at so many individual illustrations. It certainly looks beautiful at this point, but it did not serve the purpose as well as if we had maybe illustrated one food from each of the food groups, and more specifically, maybe a food that we really liked or that we cooked often would have been a better way to represent this lesson. Or we take an entire recipe or an entire meal and illustrate the individual components and speak about those foods, or maybe the nutritional content in those foods or the history of those foods. I think that would have been a better way to approach this lesson. Moving on, we have breathing and the blood, and I really, really love the way these 2 illustrations turned out. The heart took a long time, and I'm okay that it took a long time because it is our life, and our heart also represents metaphorically our emotions. And so I'm okay. There's actually, if I'm not mistaken, I have 3 illustrations of the heart. I'm okay that this one took a long time. I think that it was really important to really understand this thing that keeps us alive, the intricacies of the heart, the beauty of the heart. And so we do have the exterior, and we also have like a cross section. The lungs was another one that I actually am happy that we spent so much time talking about it and learning about it, and the illustration. The purpose of an illustration, again, for these lessons is when you are looking at that detail and choosing as much detail as you want to illustrate, it allows you, in my opinion, to have awe and reverence for the material that we're talking about. And because we're talking about the human being, in my opinion, spiritually, this is a great time to show praise for us. We do believe in God, so praise to God for the miracle of life. Of all the creations, the human being is one of the most amazing, profound, just I don't even have enough words. I should have a better repertoire of vocabulary to explain just how amazing the human creation is and how elevated we can be as human beings and how devolved we can be. We can be lower than animals or we can be higher than angels. In our religion, that's the way that human beings are compared. Like when we're doing righteous things, we can be higher than the angels. When we're doing vile things, we're lower than animals. And so that when we're looking at the intricacies of our body, because we don't even know all the details of how we are kept alive, these are the bodies that we are living in, that we are caring for. These are a trust for us, for this human life that we have. Our bodies are a trust for us. And yet we don't even know even a little bit of how our bodies function and the intricacies of it. So the lesson on the lungs, I do believe that I copied both of these illustrations, again, using the book Anatomy, the Welcome to the Museum series, which I did by both the standard book as well as the junior edition. And later on, I will tell you the difference between the two. We ended up returning the junior edition and keeping this one because this one was more robust in its content and had several sections that were not available in the junior book. However, I prefer the junior book as far as size, and the illustrations that were the same were just a smaller illustrate, like they were just shrunken down a little bit, and I prefer the ease of use of that size book versus this size book. But we did use both books, and for both of these illustrations they were copied out of the book. We did use the onion skins extensively in our main lesson books. These main lesson books are from the vendor A Child's Dream. They measure 9.5 inches by 12 inches, and each page is separated by an onion skin. And then this is the middle of the book. I did forget to tell you that I actually changed the book a little bit. There were a few lessons at the beginning of the book that I wasn't pleased with, and I believe I needed some extra pages in the back of the book to finish up the lessons. And the last thing is that I accidentally started in a main lesson book that was already used, and I didn't realize that because I was starting from what I thought was the beginning of the book. And once we got through a few pages, I realized that the back of the book, I've already removed them now, had about 2 or 3 pages that my son, when he was in his, I think, physics or chemistry main lesson block, had started in this book. So I was short a few pages. So I unstapled the pages. I removed those pages. I inserted a few extra pages from another main lesson book, and then I stapled them back together. It's not perfect. You can tell that it's like a little bit off, but that gave me a few extra pages in the beginning that I believe I rewrote 1 or 2 of these lessons, so it will look a little bit different than the illustrations and the lessons if you're looking through the playlist. And it gave me a few extra pages in the front that at this moment I probably won't use, but for the sake of these lessons and for sharing them with you, I probably will include a few lessons and you'll be able to see the videos on those. So once we got to the center of the book, we're looking at a 2-page spread that is of the onion skin. There's also a rough side to the onion skin and a smooth side. When we were doing our illustrations using the onion skin, we only did it on the rough side. The smooth side just doesn't take the color pencils quite the same way, and I really love the texture of the rough side. It's almost like newsprint, which I really like that kind of texture. I like the way that the color pencils work on that kind of texture and just the way the illustrations look in the end. It's really one of my favorite types of paper. So then for every illustration, there is a written portion. These written portions sometimes were my process of taking the material that we learned and distilling it down so that I was ready for either questions or discussion when we did do our lessons moving forward. Or I would do this, I don't think for this main lesson block I did this often, but if I did, it would come before I presented the lesson. Maybe on occasion it did, because those lessons were the best. When I was able to read ahead and present the lesson, I thought they were the best. I think my daughter thought they went too long because generally when I am talking, as you can tell, I am going to talk far more than if I'm just reading. It's very, like, these chapters are very concise and short. I can't imagine them taking more than 10 minutes. I am a slow reader, so it could take a little bit more. If you're a fast reader, it could take less. But when I'm delivering a lesson, it's going to take 20 or 30 minutes. So blood, the healer. So again, we're working on the heart, and we're having a bit more of a holistic spiritual look at some of these topics, which you are probably not going to find in some of the basic anatomy books. They're going to be very scientific and devoid of any spiritualism, in my opinion. And so being able to include that, because the curriculum does, and because as a religious family we want to anyway, I liked that there were indications within the chapter where I could include that. This is an illustration where you can see I use the onion skin to show the outside of the heart, and then when you flip the page over, you're almost seeing a cross section. So you're seeing kind of with a little bit of the valve, a little bit of where the blood flow should be, based on if you're really pressing it down, you can kind of see how the blood would flow through, because each of these valves opens and closes in a very specific, very safe, rhythmic way. And so in here you can kind of see that the process of it, almost like an action, but not quite, because this is 2D and this is an illustration. For these illustrations, I was finally realizing that it was taking too long, and especially for the liver, like this was a very simple, I can't imagine this illustration taking more than 15 or 20 minutes. Then we move on to the kidneys, and again, I'm trying to be more mindful of the illustrations not taking too long. And then we moved on to the five senses. And in the book, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that there's just one chapter on the five senses, but we ended up creating 3 entries for these lessons, and that was because we ended up buying a few more resources. So as I share with you the books, there are resources that we bought during our main lesson block. Some things I ordered before, they didn't arrive until after we started, so they weren't in how we put together our main lesson block or unit study. And then some books, and this series in particular is the one that I want to talk about. Once we read one in this series, I liked it so much I tracked down the other ones. So I believe this is the first one that I had. It's called Ears, You and Your Body Ears. It's by Douglas Mathers, and I don't think all of the authors are different for this series. This series it's by Troll Associates. I'm pretty sure that publisher is no longer in business. And I noticed in the back, it told me the other books in this series. And so I tracked them down secondhand. I believe they were, including shipping and with the different vendors that I bought them from, each of these books roughly ended up being about $4 to $5, maybe $6 max for each book in the end. So that's potentially less than a book of the newer resources that I got, and a little bit more than the price that we would have paid when these books were published. But, you have to account for inflation. So I think that I got a pretty fair deal for these books because they were purchased secondhand. This is the first book that I found locally at a secondhand bookshop. And whenever I'm looking at bookshops, secondhand bookshops, or library bookstores, that's another really great place. I think that's the place that I've gotten the majority of our secondhand books. I am looking for nonfiction books, ones that can work with our main lesson blocks or unit studies. So I'm always just sort of on the lookout for those kinds of resource materials. Now, I still really love books from the 70s, 80s, 90s, even early 2000s. I like their illustrations, and I happen to like their content as well. It is not always a good idea to do this. And I actually, maybe not 70s, I should say 80s. I think the oldest books I have are from the mid 80s, not 70s. The reason why it's not always good to do that is because in all subject areas, but especially in science, we're looking at new discoveries and new scientific opinions and theories every decade at least, and probably every 5 years. And if we're really into the subject, every year there's something new that we're learning. So having a book like this can be a good thing, but also it can be a bad thing if you are doing, if you're sharing information that has now been abrogated or has been updated or changed. So the way that first of all, I loved this book so much, that's why I got the other ones in this series. Now, when there were facts in here that I questioned, I just went to the internet and looked them up. And it's funny because some of the things that I really questioned, like, oh, I don't know if that's accurate, ended up being completely accurate. So it goes to show also sometimes our own assumptions can be incorrect. What I liked about this book as well, and I would actually include this in a physics main lesson block, is that because in a physics main lesson block, we're going through optics and acoustics and several other topics where both the eye book potentially, but primarily the ear book would really help support those lessons. But also because this book does something that I love so much that sometimes I seek out books that have just this part, and that is hands-on activities or projects or some kind of experiment or demonstration that you can do to really understand the material. And this book really delivered in that way. So while it is just you're learning about the ear, you're actually learning about so much more when you're studying sound, that especially the hands-on, like I feel like that is golden when it comes to our lessons. So the project that we tried to do was this one with a wine glass and water. Now we don't have wine glasses, so we tried to use other glassware and it didn't work. So that's something that I'm sort of just on the lookout the next time I'm at a thrift shop, or if I notice a glass that's especially fine that can do this, then I still want to get this in order to do this demonstration. There were a few other things that we did that related to this book, or that we had based on other materials that we had from our physics main lesson block that we included so that we could really make this lesson really full. So whereas in this book it might have only been one lesson, actually I take it back, I apologize. There were actually multiple lessons related to the ear, and the eye has an entire lesson. I think maybe so the other senses were just collected into one chapter. So actually there were more than one chapter for ears. What ended up happening was that this ended up being almost a week of light study throughout, and then we also had our illustrations. And then what ended up happening was that I then started to hunt down, once we did this book, I started to hunt down the other books, but we were still progressing with our main lesson block and trying to do these books as well, because we would progress through one of these topic areas, and then we would include these books in our opening activities just so that we could get some of that content, because I felt like it was so well done. Yes, the illustrations are dated, and now I know the content is not all that dated, but I personally love getting a single book on a topic rather than a book that has many topics, because you can really dive deep and broad when you are doing a book like this. So if you ever come across, and so actually let me show you the ones. There's eyes, you and your body, eyes. There's heart and lungs, muscles and bones. And these are the books that we would focus on at this point to do the remainder of our lessons, like the lesson work that we need to include. Even though we've gone through these topics, the lessons, the written content and the illustrations, we would use these books as refreshers. Then we have the brain. And then of course the one we started with was the ears. And so these books ended up being so valuable for us. So if you are ever in a bookstore or you come across some of these garage sale or library bookstore, I highly recommend that you just browse through them, especially if they're a good deal. Then, include them in your home library along with maybe a more current resource. So for the ears, we did a cross section of the ears, which I was trying not to do so many things that were internal, but this actually ended up being a really good lesson for us, because understanding the mechanics of our eardrum and how we process sound was really important, because it goes back to understanding, or rather it goes back to the point of our five senses have to translate what we are sensing into something that our brain can process. And going through that was really thrilling. For our eyes, we did a self-portrait, and I love this one so much. I think my daughter ended up doing 2. I ended up doing 1, but it was a little bit on the hastier side. I wish that I had spent a little bit more time, but again, I was at the point of thinking these illustrations can't take more than a half an hour. But I love this so much. Now you can either take a picture of your eye and enlarge it and look at it. You can use a mirror, but however you do this, or you can actually gaze into someone else's eyes and draw their eyes and they can draw your eyes. But this was a really good hands-on activity or just an illustration. We really love this one as well. For these lessons, because the illustration was quite small, I included the content around it, but I don't think that was the best idea. I think I should have done the illustration, labeled the illustration, and then saved an entire page for our written content. I think this was before I actually included the other pages, and I was worried that we weren't going to have enough pages for our other lessons, but really it would have been better just to pull out another main lesson book so that we could really write the content that we needed. Same with the ears. At this point, I was just adding some information around the ear and labeling the illustration rather than doing an entire page of content. When it came to taste, touch, and smell, I included the content from Muscles and Bones by Charles Kovacs a lot more accurately or closer to the book. Rather, in these 2 lessons, we're looking at the mechanics of the eyes and the ears and how our brain is processing that information. When it came to taste, touch, and smell, I did want to do a self-portrait of the mouth, but we ended up copying it out of a book, and the book that we copied it out of was The Human Body Atlas, How the Human Body Works. This was an amazing resource. This is the book that I did have to cover quite a few pages, but this really feels like content that you would use in high school or even in college. It was really well done, very good information, and really good. Let me just try to look for. So here's an example. Well, this is the urinary and reproductive organs. So of course they're going to have more detailed illustrations and photographs, but I did go ahead and cover those. But the way that this book is laid out, it really feels more like a textbook, like a resource book. So you can see the amount of detail and the content. And this was a really good, we did not go through this cover to cover at all. We only went through certain sections, but it was very detailed in the content that it provided. And only on a couple occasions I needed to look at several resources to really understand or get enough content for a particular part of the subject area. But for the most part, this was a really good resource, as well as the Welcome to the Museum series. They ended up being really great in, they partnered really great. They complemented each other really great. Let me see if I can find some more illustrations to share with you. So a great resource that if you wanted to go into a bit more detail when it came to anatomy and the human body, then this is a really great resource. These are my favorite by far for this lesson. And if you're looking for the Waldorf approach, of course, the Charles Kovacs book was just a really good resource. For this lesson on taste, touch, and smell, I loved how Charles Kovacs talked about the 5 senses, in the sense that the way we use our senses, with our eyes, we could observe things that are millions of miles away, millions and millions of miles away. But with our ears, we cannot hear millions of miles away. We can maybe hear, if it was something like an explosion or thunder, we could hear dozens of miles, maybe hundreds of miles, but probably not. Maybe just at max like dozens of miles. Then when it came to, touch and, smell, right? I want to talk about smell before touch and taste. Smell, like you could maybe smell, like suppose it's a hot day and someone's mowing the lawn, like that could kind of drift on the breeze and you could smell that. Or it's a time of year when, like, say, all the blossoms for a particular tree or shrub are or blossoming. You could smell that maybe from a few miles away. But when it comes to touch, you have to be like within arm's length. Like it actually has to be on your body in order for you to use the sense of touch. And when it comes to taste, that actually has to go inside your body. So I loved how these 5 senses were related to distance. It was just such a beautiful way to talk about the 5 senses. Okay, so we have a few pages blank at the back of the book, and that is reserved for the lessons that we actually read through, but we did not write content for, and that was the last section, which was literally on muscles and bones. Okay. Next, we have these 2 books. Now, when I purchased them, I thought they were going to be different, but they're actually almost identical. The content is a little bit different, but so far, all of the illustrations were the same. I do want to be mindful of sharing with you the illustrations because there are some that are quite anatomically correct. So when I was going through this, I realized that the illustrations were the same and the content for the junior edition was a little bit simplified, but I think still between the two, like very, very good for the book that it is. And let me find you the same page here for the liver. And what I realized was that I prefer the larger format for, actually, let me just show you this one, the skin, because this is a lesson that we just did. And I want to share with you also how we ended up using the books for this unit. So here you can see that the illustration is identical. It's just that this one is smaller. And then the content is a little bit more simplified for the junior edition, and it's a little bit more robust for the original version. And then when it comes to key to plate, often there'll be a little bit more for the original version, but not always. In this case, it's almost identical. So for the illustrations, since they were the same, then we're just looking at the content as a comparison. And if I'm going to invest in a book like this, even if I had younger children, I would still get the adult version, or the original version, I should say, rather than the junior edition. But with one caveat, and this is actually kind of a major caveat that I am surprised to learn myself about how we're using these books and to share with you. I like the original version for content, but even in this original version, I find that the content is still not robust enough for us to do our lessons. Like I still need to supplement with other materials and resources. And then when it comes to the junior edition, you're going to get even less information as well. So if you've got really young children, this completely makes sense. But as your children grow, or if you're anticipating using these resources as they grow, then the larger version is, in my opinion, going to be better, because already I use these resources to put together our lessons, and this book is going to be part of those lessons. So I want to be able to get as much information as I can, because I can always filter out the information, but I won't be able to bring it in if this is the only resource that I'm using. So if you're reading this to young children, you can easily summarize the section so that you can get the feel of what's being said. However, and this is a surprise to me, I found myself gravitating towards the junior edition more for one main reason, and that is the size of this book. It is so much easier to hold. It is not so heavy. It is not cumbersome. Using this book, you need a large space. You can't hold it like you would reading a book like this. This is easy to hold. You can read. Let me find another page that's okay to share with you. You can hold it easily with one hand. You can read it. You can turn the pages. All works really well. This, you cannot hold it with one hand, not without it being cumbersome and awkward and heavy. And then it does take up a large portion of our school table. And the other thing is that since we use a lot of these illustrations as inspiration for our own lessons, I wanted to have this easy for both of us to use. And if the book is lying down, it's not as easy for both my daughter and I to look at the pages. But if it is upright, then we can both see it. And I do have a little stand to hold books upright. However, this is way more cumbersome and awkward to hold the book upright. It feels like it's going to tip over. It ends up being not as stable as a book like this, holding it upright is no problem at all because it's not too heavy and it's not too tall. So it's really, really challenging to decide which one is going to be better overall. This one is surprisingly better overall for usage, for illustration, even for content. It's just not as robust as this content. So if you never saw how robust the original version was for the content, then I would recommend this one. Surprisingly, I'm surprised that I'm saying this, but for us, since we have so many others in the series, we are going to continue with the large format book and just appreciate that it has a little bit more content than this one. On the blog post for our anatomy unit and main lesson block, you can find pictures of both books side by side so you can see a comparison for the content as well as the illustrations so that you can make your best choice in deciding between these two books. Okay, so let's move on to a couple of books, 3 books in particular, that I included either right as we were starting this unit or after we actually started the unit. Now, the one book that I was having trouble finding was a neutral book, or maybe a more scientific approach on nutrition. The books that I was finding, and granted, I really only just checked Amazon and maybe one other bookseller to look for a book on nutrition, and all of the books that I found were diet related, and that's not what I was looking for. It'd be like, the benefits of keto or vegan diet or the what to avoid or anti-inflammatory diet, and I wasn't looking for that. I just wanted a very neutral perspective on food. Now, I did not find that, or actually I take it back, I actually did find that, but they were college resources, like college textbooks, and they were several $100s, like between $100 and $300 were the ones that I was finding, and I just didn't want to spend that kind of money on that kind of resource for this lesson. So I ended up getting 3 books instead, and they don't exactly serve the purpose, but I think they're going to be okay. The Quranic Prescription, Unlocking the Secrets to Optimal Health, actually was not the book that I was expecting. This is a little bit more of I'm going to say diet or dietary book, because it's talking about, the importance of certain foods or the qualities of these foods, which is great. It's important, but it wasn't actually what I was looking for. However, for instance, problems with today's wheat and other grains. Sometimes I'm not sure if that is something on the way that we are processing the food or growing the food or our bodies or how we are digesting it or how we are exercising. Like, I feel like there are so many nuanced factors in understanding diet and nutrition and exercise and sleep and everything together that sometimes something that's very specific may or may not actually be the case. Now, this book does have the religious aspect that I was really grateful for. So it's going to talk about the Quranic ayahs that support some of the things regarding diet and nutrition. And one of my favorite, I shouldn't say it's my favorite ayah in the Quran related to this, but it is something that's very beautiful that we are to take from the good, and I'm probably going to translate this wrong for a minute, but the good and the good for you. So of the good food and the good for you food, like that's the kinds of foods that we should be having. And what's really beautiful is that pretty much all the food is good and good for you, but there are a few foods that are forbidden for us as Muslims. And then there are foods that are mentioned in the Quran and the Sunnah, which we as Muslims try to include, or that we recognize as being foods that are mentioned in the Quran. So this book, Quranic Prescription, we ended up using very sparingly, and I was debating whether this was a book that we would keep or not, because as soon as I received it and I looked through, I'm like, oh, it didn't quite serve exactly the purpose that I wanted, but I still chose to keep it because I think it's still a really valuable resource for us and for this unit. Eating Etiquette is a book that I am so excited to have. Okay, this book is a very tiny book, but when I looked at it on Amazon, I think it was coming up at around, I think $50. And that's because the seller or the book was only available in the UK. And so I have a friend who lives in the UK. I also have a friend who is traveling to the UK. So I asked her about this, and my friend's sister, my friend as well, was able to buy it. And I think that it was like less than £2. So that's maybe $3. And I think shipping was maybe a couple of pounds as well. So it ended up being like a really affordable book. And then my friend brought it back. So after she had visited. So the thing is, I did not have this at the beginning. It was something that I had my eye on. And we were only able to use it sparingly because by the time I got it, it was towards the end of our unit. The reason why I love it so much is that this is the exact kind of content I want for a main lesson block on anatomy. Because our anatomy block included physiology and nutrition, this is the kind of book that I really wanted, because it goes through the different, and that we've only just done a few pages. We really did not get through as much content as we wanted to, primarily because the content that we did get through, we got through so slowly because it encouraged so much discussion. This is the kind of content I love because it tells us not just the food that we're eating, but how we eat the food and our manners and our etiquette around it. So for instance, I'll give you a really simple one, and I can't remember if it's in here or not, but we always learned growing up that there are some cultures where the food is presented on a communal platter. And there's etiquette on how you eat on a communal platter. So if you're not taking from that platter onto your own dish, then how you eat from that dish is really important. So if you're eating from that dish with your fingers, you're not going to get saliva on your fingers, and you're going to also eat in a particular way. And I can't remember if it's just 2 fingers or if it's 3 fingers and the thumb on how you're actually taking that food and the way that you put it in your mouth without getting saliva on your hand. The other thing is that you're going to take from the portion in front of you. You're not going to lean over to your neighbor's side or across on the complete opposite side. You're eating from the portion that's in front of you. So those are 2 things that I remember. And I've only ever eaten on a communal platter very seldomly. And in those times, because it wasn't my custom, a lot of times they would just offer me a small dish because they could tell that I didn't know what I was doing, and maybe out of my own comfort too. But those are some of the things. So this talks about like how much food you should eat. Of course, everything is supported with evidence. One of my favorite ones is, you should just eat like enough to stand upright. But if you do need more food, then it should not be more than 1/3 of your stomach filled with solid food and 1/3 filled with liquid food, and then 1/3 left empty, which of course our stomach is not like a balloon. It is closed, and then as we fill it, right? But that's a good reminder on how much food we actually should be having. And another one of my favorite evidences or hadith in here is that one of the worst vessels to fill is your stomach. So it's a reminder that we tend to overfill our stomach, and we tend to fill it with things that are not nutritious for us. The next book I want to share with you that I cannot remember if I actually had when this unit started is Food Anatomy. And we use this one with our nutrition section because actually this one gave us a lot of nutritional, not nutritional facts, but food facts. And what I loved about this one so much is that it gave us food from like around the world. Here's this section on growing rice and the different kinds of rice and corn and grain. And I thought this was like such an amazing book, and the price point was less than $20. So enough for us for this particular, for our unit, and less than the nutrition, which obviously the nutrition books would have been more robust in its content, but of course less than that book. And we use this for a little bit of illustration inspiration on the different food groups. We use this book a lot. I got a lot of illustration because I love these kinds of illustrations. I think they're really easy to copy. I think they're beautifully done. They're simple, and you can be really successful when you're copying them into your main lesson book. So this went through all kinds of stuff related to food. Here you have a lesson on stoves. Now the content in this book, like I love the illustrations, but typically the content is very limited. It's quite sparingly. The content is not as robust as the illustrations. I buy this book for the illustrations. The content I love, but it's usually never enough to support a lesson or a main lesson block. But if you were curious, not just for an anatomy main lesson block, but maybe for your botany main lesson block or for a geography or a history main lesson block, I think this would be a great addition. I have 2 more books to share with you. The Human Body was a book that we ended up not using very much. If we did use it, and let me just make sure the pages are okay. If we did use it, we use it for a very specific illustration and content. So this was one page that worked well with our 5 senses. I think that we also used the one on the spine. Let me just look at some of the other illustrations. This one is on blood. I did find slightly different content material in this book. And this is a dated resource, so it's also just kind of pulling out time capsule with some of these pages. But we did not read this book cover to cover. The illustrations are a little bit more modest in this book as well. And so if that's what you were looking for, then this would be a great addition. As a resource, I think this is a fine addition, a fine resource. However, because we had more current resources and more varied resources, we didn't rely on this one as heavily as if, in comparison to this being our only resource, we would have relied on it a lot more than we actually did. And then the last book that we only used maybe twice is Uncover the Human Body. And this book is like a great interactive book because you can really start to see the different layers of the body. I personally don't care for a book like this only because I myself find it really hard to know what's the progress of how we're supposed to read this book. What is the unifying factor of the content. I do better with say very solid paragraphs rather than these kinds of captions. This works really great for some temperaments and some personalities. For me, it doesn't, but if you have a child that likes just a little tidbit of information here and there, or even an adult who might just want to take a little bit from each page, this would be a great addition for you. And if you have a child who just wants to just get lost in the process of this book, which is quite interactive, then this would also be a really great resource. We ended up not using it except for a couple of lessons. Let me share with you the hands-on materials. This is something that I could not find when we put together this lesson, and I knew that I had it, but then I wondered, did I give it away? Did I give it to someone else? This is a model of the lungs. And so when you pull it down, and I apologize, I am still recovering from some thumb surgery, so I don't quite have the strength at the moment. But when you pull this part down, you can see that the lungs, which are balloons, you can see how they inflate. And this is so great to understand how our lungs function and how we inhale and how that works. So this was from a science vendor, and it came with a little bit of content as well. And so this is just a super simple hands-on activity. I love it so much. If I had more hands-on activities for our anatomy unit, I certainly would have used them. I think that this unit ended up being really heavy on the oral lessons and the read aloud lessons, and less so on demonstrations and activities. One thing that we enjoyed was the Human Body, Professor Noggin's game, but we couldn't really enjoy this until we had gone through a bit of content, just because it's trivia based, and if you don't know enough, then you're just guessing and not really enjoying the game. So we did need to go through a bit more content in order to do this. I also had a workbook. Actually, I forgot that. I'm going to bring that out to share with you too, that I was using as well, but we couldn't use that until after we had gone through enough content to make that workbook valuable and educational. Because if you don't know anything about the subject area, a workbook's not going to help you. And so you need to get through some content. Anyway, we really love the Professor Noggins games. They are trivia based, so you do need to know a little bit. The way that we tend to play it is we'll just divide up maybe 5 cards each, and then we will give the questions. We don't even use the dice. And then whoever gets it right, usually it's just the 2 of us now at this point playing, and then we'll just collect and see who got the most cards in the end. I don't think I might have had this when I was first putting this unit together, and while we have had this for many years, I keep giving this away and it keeps coming back and we keep not using it. But this is really great for younger students. I mean, maybe I used it once, but I'm pretty sure I didn't. This is like an apron that you can wear, and then you can put the different parts, the different organs onto the apron so that you can see where they are inside your body. Really great hands-on, but because we were doing our anatomy unit in middle school and this feels more like an elementary project, it never came into our lessons in a meaningful way. But as a product and as a hands-on product, I think it's really great, but it just didn't serve us very well. And I think that is the problem sometimes when it comes to, and there's some on the back, the kidneys are on the back. When it comes to materials, is that we might find something that serves really well for our lesson, but it's so juvenile that my older students are not going to enjoy it because they're going to feel like they've got something that's kind of babyish, which is too bad because sometimes that's like the perfect time and the appropriate content, but it just needs to be maybe like you could still do this, but if it was just maybe not as juvenile, or maybe if the rest of the product wasn't as juvenile, then maybe it would have worked out better. And the last thing that I have before I get you the workbook is somebody. It's the 5 human anatomy games in one. So this is, we actually had 2 anatomy games. This is the one that really worked well. Could maybe use Operation too. That might be a good game to play. This is a game that we've actually really enjoyed over the years, whether we were doing an anatomy unit or not. And it's one where you are basically trying to collect all of the organs for your body. And then I believe it comes with how many answer keys? It's been a while since we played this. I don't think we even played this one time for this unit, just because it's a little more juvenile. My daughter now at the time was 13 and 14, so it's just not one that we played. And I think we just relied more on the Professor Noggins game as an opening activity. So you are given, or you have 2 sets of cards, and I believe that it explains some of the organ on the card or the body part that you are studying, and then you're trying basically just to get all of the parts onto your body, and then whoever gets them first wins. This is a fabulous game. However, you do have really small, I think we have almost all the pieces, but of course some pieces could be missing. But that's the thing, is that they are so tiny and so easy to lose that this is something that you would want to be really mindful when you are using, especially if you have young children, where parts could get lost, because then the game is just not going to be playable. You still have the cards, but it's not going to be playable if you lose all of the pieces. This is a really old game. I'm sorry, I don't know if it's still available. I believe we got it from Rainbow Resource. Rainbow Resource was a company that we used to purchase so much of our educational curriculum from, like our books and our hands-on projects, our kits. They are fabulous for those things, but it is a Christian company, and so you do need to be mindful if you are looking for secular content, just to sift through and make sure that if you do not want Christian-based content, and we're with a charter school, so we would not be allowed to buy religious content. So anytime I do have we're Muslims, so anytime I do have religious content, that's just purchased like on our own, and those are not samples that we would be able to submit. But for any of the games and kits, like if they were secular, they were definitely things that we enjoyed and liked, and I found that they had, and probably still do, the most extensive most extensive selection of materials for education, and specifically for the homeschooling family. The last two things I want to share with you are the Waldorf curriculum. We had 2 Waldorf resources that we used for this main lesson block, and we also have a workbook. But the nutrition and physiology portion, or the main lesson book that you would use for this main lesson block, it's well done, but we didn't use it. We used it previously, but this time around, because the first few lessons were ones that I was not interested in doing, and because I really enjoyed the Charles Kovacs book, we ended up primarily using the Charles Kovacs book. This book is going to go through a lot of things that are similar, but it's going to go through it in its own way. Now, it appears that there are fewer lessons, so this block might have taken less time, or you could combine multiple lessons in one with the Charles Kovacs book. But this book is going to have both the lesson, examples of lesson activities, and it's going to include illustrations. And you're not going to find illustrations for the most part. There may be some in the Charles Kovacs books, but in general, if you are finding illustrations, they're to support the content itself. They could potentially be used as illustration inspiration, but I don't believe we ever did. Let me show you an example, because there were a few. For instance, actually, you probably could use that as illustration inspiration. So this one does have color illustrations, and the progress of the lessons differs a little bit from the Charles Kovacs book. So we're starting with an introduction to physiology and nutrition, exercise and burning calories, a lot about food, nutrition, and diet in the beginning. And this is a place where you can get very personal with how you deliver this content. There was a section on fast food here that could potentially be controversial, I suppose, depending on your opinion about fast food or eating out in general, eating from home, or the kinds of foods you make. So, and then going into eating disorders, which we did not personally go into eating disorders. We went into healthy eating, but we did not go into the disordered eating. And that might be something that you choose to do or not choose to do. That's the beauty of this kind of curriculum, is that you have a lot of autonomy over the lessons that you're going to deliver and the reasons why behind them. So for our family in particular, while we do talk about nutrition and weight and health, primarily it's feed your body the food that it needs. Before I'm saying don't eat this or be mindful of this or calories about that, the focus is what does your body need? And right now we're focused a lot on protein because that is like what we're either lacking in or just being conscious of to make sure that we're getting our required protein intake every day. And when you are focused on that, in my opinion, naturally you don't maybe have the room or the desire for some of the things that are maybe not as healthy for you. So I would rather say, make sure you're eating healthy and then eat whatever you want, rather than don't eat this, don't eat that, don't eat this. That's just the way that I view these topics, in the hopes of avoiding an unhealthy relationship with food. But we are foodies in our family, and we do love cooking and eating, and so just being mindful of how we're doing that and making sure that it is nutritious and healthy for us, and that we're not overeating, because that is a principle in our religion. The last resource that I want to share with you is another one that I'm not sure if I had when we first started this unit, but this is The Human Body. This is the 100 series by Carson DeLosa. They are a company that has a lot of workbooks and other educational material. And this one is just the workbook. It does not come with any content. My guess is that this supports a textbook or another material. And what I wish they would have done was buy a workbook that actually included content. That way my daughter could read the content and then easily answer the questions or the workbook. This was not that kind of a workbook. So the problem that we had in using this, and I think, so we used about 20 pages. The problem that we had in using this was, one, I could not use it until we were done with our muscles and bones part of our anatomy main lesson block, and that was the last section. So there are 3 sections. Muscles and bones is the last section. That's really the anatomy portion, and this book is what concentrates on that portion. So I couldn't use it until we had already started it or had completed it. Then I included 1 or 2 pages per day or per week in my daughter's packets of workbook pages. So she primarily does language arts and math, but I included some of these, but it wasn't working because it wasn't supportive of our main lesson block, and it did not have the content that she could easily learn or review before answering the workbook pages. So it was a good thought, but poor execution. I hope that you enjoyed this look at our review of our anatomy resources and books. I hope that you'll check out the blog post that accompanies this video, where you can find links to all of these resources, as well as video tutorials for the lessons that we did. And as always, if you'd like to see how we're homeschooling on a daily basis, you can now find me daily on my website at pepperandpine.com.